So let's do that. We're starting off the week with a threat of another government shutdown looming as a real, tangible possibility. Last Friday, aides and lawmakers appeared optimistic that they could reach a deal by today, but now negotiations have stalled. One of the main sticking points is the number of additional beds to give to Immigration and Customs Enforcement to detain immigrants who come across the border. Democrats have proposed reducing the number of beds, arguing that more humane policy is to let asylum seekers without criminal records be released while they await their immigration proceedings. In interviews yesterday, Senator Richard Shelby, the lead Republican negotiator, didn't appear optimistic about the chances of reaching a deal ahead of Friday's deadline.
I think the talks are stalled right now. I'm hoping we can get off the dime later today or in the morning because time's ticking away. But we've got some problems with the Democrats dealing with ICE, that is, detaining criminals that come into the U.S. and they want to cap on them. We don't want to cap on that.
The thought has been that you have to make a deal, you have to announce something by tomorrow. Do you feel that's a deadline, and how confident are you that you can reach a deal by tomorrow?
Chris, that is a deadline. I'm not confident we're going to get there. I'm hoping we'll get there.
So is it fair to say whatever Congress hands him, he'll sign? He just may not be enthusiastic about it.
No, I don't think so.
You're not ready to go there.
No,
you can't definitively. We cannot definitively rule out a government shutdown at the end of this week.
You absolutely cannot.
So, Mike Barnicle, a little confused here, which is nothing new. The Democrats seemed to have Donald Trump backing down on the number, how much money he wanted for the wall. And we started to hear that a deal was going to be done. And then Sunday, Democrats started talking about limiting the number of illegal immigrants that could be detained. And in fact, Republicans asked for an exception for criminals. And Democrats said, no, 165,000 beds will be enough. If you're talking about Donald Trump's 13th century wall, seems to me that's an easy political fight for Democrats to win. But now they're adding new conditions. Suddenly it gets a lot murkier, doesn't it?
A lot murkier, Joe, as well as more dangerous than dynamite, actually, because at the end of this week, if there is no deal, if we have another shutdown, that in addition to the lives of the people who will be unemployed and going without paychecks, you're talking about the ripple effect within the national economy and the added incentive of people, average voters, to say, none of these people can govern. None of them can govern. And the lack of faith in the system of government, which is already at an all-time low, is going to increasingly dip.
Yeah, you know, Eugene Robinson, sometimes you need to know when to take a win. And again, just my opinion, doesn't look like the Democrats right now know how to take a win. If this government is shut down over Donald Trump's stupid, phony wall, that is a fight that Democrats win every day. If it's about Democrats refusing the Republicans' exception to be able to detain criminals who are illegal immigrants as well, I don't think that fares as well in the crosstabs. Do you have any insight into what's going on, and are the Democrats really going to add a condition and then shut down this government on Friday over that?
Well, I don't think Democrats are going to shut down the government or be seen as shutting down the government. I do think that when you say, you know, criminals as opposed to asylum seekers, right? I think there's a good and legitimate interest in curbing this administration's ability to arbitrarily put asylum seekers in detention when what they're doing is perfectly legal. If you talk about criminals and define that word, then obviously, if they're criminal. They should be detained. But I read this whole thing as Democrats seeing just how far they can push this. They know they're in a strong position. They have apparently the Republican negotiators talking about numbers that Donald Trump says are unimaginably low. Yet they're there. So Republicans are not the only ones who can move the goalposts and just see how far they can push things. We'll see how far all this gets pushed. I'm not convinced that this breakdown in talks was so much a breakdown as a sort of last-minute wrangle. But we'll see. We'll see. I've been surprised before, but we'll see.
Well, yeah, and Nancy Pelosi is such a gifted legislator. I mean, it sort of reminds me of what LBJ said. He never wanted to win a vote with 75 votes. He wanted to win with 53, 54 votes because that meant that he pushed and he got as much as he could possibly get. So maybe this is just, Mika, a negotiating tactic, and we'll see what happens midweek. But this government cannot be shut down again.
Well, after cooperating with President Trump on a months-long deployment to the southern border, another governor is pulling back members of his state's National Guard. This morning, California's Democratic Governor, Gavin Newsom, will reveal plans to redeploy the troops to fight wildfires and assist the state's drug task force, calling the operation at the border a manufactured crisis, which it appears to be.
Well, of course it is.
This comes just days after New Mexico's governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, withdrew her state's troops while ordering service members from other states to leave New Mexico. Governor Grisham said New Mexico will not take part in the president's charade of border fear-mongering by misusing our diligent National Guard troops. But this month, the president is sending more troops to the border as military officials warn that readiness for other operations will be damaged. So literally, he's getting pushback from all sides, even from where he's sending the troops. According to the New York Times, senior military officers are voicing greater worries that the border deployed troops are not conducting the training needed for their regular missions, while other military units must now pick up the routine duties on behalf of their deployed colleagues.
So Richard Haass, this is damaging readiness in so many ways. First, Donald Trump, the commander-in-chief, is sending our troops to an imaginary conflict.
Crazy.
And in so doing, they're not going through their regular training. And by being down at the southern border, where Donald Trump's created this imaginary crisis, you, of course, have other troops that are having to try to fill in for the other troops on real missions that are having to try to make do without all the troops that are down at the border. This is a real readiness crisis, and I'm glad some military officials are starting to speak up, but it seems we need to hear testimony on Capitol Hill from other generals about the problems this is causing.
Yeah, you've got the readiness angle. You've always got a third, roughly, of your active forces there. You've got a third who are supposed to be prepared to be deployed, and you've got a third who are recovering from it. And this is taking numbers out of that mix. It's not a real mission. I think even worse in some ways than the readiness issue, Joe, is the politics of it. The idea that our men and women in uniform are essentially being used for political purposes rather than for real security purposes sets a terrible precedent. The other thing that's really ironic here is you have these Democratic governors essentially arguing a kind of states' rights position that used to be the province of Republicans and conservatives, but you have Democrats essentially taking their troops out of a federal mission, saying a state mission is more important. It's just another sign of just how our politics have been turned upside down.
In addition, Joe, the public, the average citizen, would be stunned by the cost of this mission. We are now talking hundreds of millions of dollars to deploy United States Army troops, Coast Guard, whatever, to the border at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars at a time when it's crazy. It is really crazy.
Nick Confessori, deploying troops to the border, despite the fact that border crossings are at a 50-year low?
Well, the entire problem with this debate from the start, Joe, is that it has been built on a tissue of exaggerations and lies and not on real policy problems. There is already a wall at the southern border for a lot of the border. It's possible that the Border Patrol would like to add a few more miles here and there, improve some of the tech around the soft border wall. But there is not a crisis in the sense that we have in the past defined a crisis. And the president has created one, and now he's in a box, and we're in his box of solving a problem that he created. I think the answer in the end for the budget shutdown and for a deal on the wall is going to be the same as it was 6 months ago, a year ago, that there's some money in there for some form of security on the border that Democrats have voted for in the past, and the president can call it a wall or anything else, and that is how you get out of this.
Well, I mean, again, we are sitting here talking about a president who is so conflicted. And I mean, Joe mentioned the data of the number of border crossings that are happening. The public, the polls show that people don't want the wall. The generals saying this is weakening the military, our readiness. The governors who are redeploying the troops or sending them back. I mean, at what point, Richard Haass, are we not talking about our military readiness and whether or not this impacts it, but the president's fitness? And I say that with a straight face. This president is clearly, unless there's an argument out there that I'm not hearing or I don't understand, that is legitimate in terms of sending troops to the border to try and protect us from these incoming caravans that the president is talking about. Unless there's some reason for it, this president is pushing the boundaries, the norms, but the boundaries of his presidency. He's doing something political.
Well, I agree. And what it's going to take, though, Mika, I think it would be for leaders in uniform or some recently retired military leaders to stand up and say just that, to basically say there's no pressing national security reason to do this, that it's hurting us. We ought to be keeping these troops in Syria. We ought to be thinking about other parts of the world where we have real security threats, or we just ought to reduce the operations tempo on these forces. American troops have been stretched. They've been over deployed for recent years. Families have paid an enormous price. So unless something really meets the test, that it's essential, that it's vital for these troops to be put in harm's way or put in the field, we ought to basically look to ways to restore the American military. But it's more than anyone else, it's going to take, I think, military leaders, active or retired, to make this argument.
Well, and Gene, think about how bizarre this is. The President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, is sending troops down to the border where the military will tell you, we don't need the troops. Yeah. We had a threats assessment from the intel community. The border is not a threat. But then you have Donald Trump saying, well, Syria, we're going to remove troops from Syria. Russia, we need to be allies with Russia. I mean, just look at, again, tapes of Helsinki to see there's something seriously wrong with that relationship where we're cozying up to Putin. And then, of course, this past weekend, North Korea, where Donald Trump, he talks about his economic miracle in the State of the Union, and then he talks about the economic miracle of Kim Jong-un in a country that, if you look at satellite photos, is black at night compared to a very well lit up South Korea.
I know it's about the border. This is a bigger deal than we have made it thus far. I mean, the President of the United States is using the military as a prop, as a political prop, and that is totally outrageous. That should never be done. They've been sent on a useless mission that they know is useless. It's totally unneeded. It's beyond absurd. It's just malfeasance of really the worst kind because of what it does to these military families. It's just using them as props, and that's ridiculous. As for North Korea, I'm just at a loss. I'm totally at a loss. Whenever he says nice things about Kim Jong-un, who executed his uncle with a missile in the middle of Pyongyang and hundreds of other people.
And also, Gene, beat to death an American college student from University of Virginia whose parents in Ohio have to listen every day that Donald Trump says he's in love with Kim Jong-un. I mean, you wonder what they're thinking.
Again, fitness comes to mind.
It's outrageous. It's outrageous. It's outrageous. It's crazy. They're going to have another summit. It'll be in that sort of weird dimension in which North Korea is actually cooperating and going to give up their nuclear weapons. But that's not our reality. That's never going to happen.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.